The following lecture, Symposium, Kazantzakis over a glass of wine, was sponsored by the Melbourne branch of the International Society of Friends of Nikos Kazantzakis at the Ithacan Society Centre, Melbourne, on November 16, 2014. Howard F. Dosser is the author of Colin Wilson, The Man and His Mind. He enjoys retirement following a career as a teacher and educational administrator. He is a regular presenter to the Existentialist Society in Melbourne and has produced a range of essays on the life and work of Nikos Kazantzakis. Here is Howard Dosser.
In 1922, Nikos Kazantzakis found himself in Berlin as a delegate to the Congress of Radical School Reformers. While there, he was reading Plato's dramatic dialogue, Symposium, and this was undoubtedly the prompt which led him to indicate to a Jewish woman he had just met, named Rahel, that he was considering the writing of a symposium himself. In this projected work, Kazantzakis contemplated recording a discussion between himself and Rahel as a representative figure for the whole world, in which, ambitiously, the subjects of war, hate, God, and love would be unravelled. Needless to say, Kazantzakis was steeped in the history and mythology of his native land in general, and of his island Crete in particular. He was enamoured of the classical Greek writers, among them Plato, and especially Homer, whose Odysseus became for him a symbol of the ascendant man. Clearly then, it should come as no surprise that he conceived his own writing within the context and even within the format of those historic writers. In collaboration with Professor Yannis Kakridis, he was later to produce metrical translations in modern Greek of Homer's two classics, the Iliad and the Odyssey. Regrettably, he was to die without seeing the 1965 publication of the latter. It is an extraordinary testimony to his disciplined creativity that at the same time as he was composing Symposium, he was working on early drafts of his monumental extension of Homer's saga with the Odyssey, a modern sequel, and, as we shall see, saviours of God. The word symposium is a construct of two Greek words, syn, which means with or together, and posis, which means drinking. By extension, according to the shorter Oxford Dictionary, the word refers to a convivial meeting for drinking, conversation, and intellectual entertainment. The word can refer to the meeting itself or to an account given of the meeting. It should not surprise us then to note Kazantzakis describing his proposed symposium as a calm drinking of the wine that flows throughout our bodies. With this allusion to our blood, he makes it clear that the symposium was to be a reflection on the life force that sustains all life and drives it forward. In Symposium, then, we have a poetic introduction over a glass of wine to the philosophy of Kazantzakis. In approaching the task of writing this slim volume, Kazantzakis clearly regarded Plato's work as a model for what he wanted to achieve, but it was not merely the notion of a symposium that he borrowed. In her introduction to the translation of the work, Theodore Wessels argues that it would be difficult to ignore similar structures in both works, or the many parallels and contrasts between the two that are to be found. She points out that while Homer's writing exudes a sense of joie de vivre, in Kazantzakis the mood is one of almost intense seriousness. Further, she draws attention to the distinction between the order and harmony that characterises Homer's Greece and the Kazantzakian doubt regarding the harmonious nature of reality. Plato's text is an account of a group of 7 men of aristocratic bearing, one being Plato's tutor Socrates, assembled in the home of a playwright named Agathon, who had just produced a new play. Over bread and wine, the 7 set out to expand their understanding of the nature and practice of love, and each in turn expounded to the others their particular understanding of that elusive topic. It is in this work that we read of the poet Aristophanes' notion of love as an attempt to reunite the two halves of the one personality that had been separated after an offence perpetrated against the gods. In her biography of her husband, Eleni Kazantzakis states that most probably Symposium was written between 1918 and 1920, although she later altered this judgment in favour of 1922. His friend, Pandelis Privolakis, records its production as having been between 1924 and 1925. Peter Bien, however, in his monumental study, Kazantzakis, The Politics of the Spirit, proposes evidence, both external and internal, that the version of the work that has come down to us was written as late as 1926. Further, Eleni suggests that the text was written much more rapidly than Kazantzakis would have wished. It was his preference, she reports, that he should retreat to Mount Athos and spend 2 years in its production. Regardless of the date of its being penned, the text did not immediately see the light of day. Kazantzakis abandoned it and gave it to his father, and it was not until the death of the latter in 1932 that the manuscript was found in the family home. Even so, it did not find a Greek publisher until 1971, and its first appearance in English was not until 1974, when it was translated by Theodora and Temi Wessels. In an overview of the work, Peter Bien has written that Kazantzakis made the correct decision when he decided against publishing it. Bien writes, "It is a digressive, rambling work needing rigorous revision, quite aside from its incompleteness. And the prose, despite its metaphoric wealth, is embarrassingly gushy in the manner of an even earlier work, the novella Serpent and Lily." Nevertheless, Bean ascribes some value to the manuscript in that it demonstrates how Kazantzakis was essentially engaged in the pursuit of metaphysical concerns rather than in political intrigues. For many readers, Bean's judgment will appear harsh. They will find in this compact volume many of the fundamental roots of the philosophy Kazantzakis was to embrace and proclaim throughout the remainder of his life, as well as an early formulation of the poetic language that was to characterise his subsequent writing. Certainly, it speaks powerfully of the struggle between contemplation and action that rages within mankind, a struggle that was to find a fuller treatment in Kazantzakis' later, most popular work, the novel Zorba the Greek. In turning to an analysis of Symposium, we note that from the very first draft, Kazantzakis moved away from his original notion of writing a dialogue between himself and Rahel. Indeed, his intellectual preparation for its writing went through various stages. He varied the individuals upon whom he was to base his characters, and while at one point he planned to focus it exclusively on an attempt to resolve the religious questions with which he had been concerned, in the event he assigned those issues to what may be regarded as his most important publication, Saviours of God, on which he worked concurrently and which he eventually published in 1927. The company of the Symposium his imagination finally devised was 4 in number and was comprised of the host, Arpagos, and his guests, Cosmes, Petros, and Miros. These 4, however, are representative figures, and it is not difficult to identify the historic personages they represent. Arpagos is Kazantzakis himself, while Cosmos is Ian Dragoumis, a political activist who held the post of Consul General in both Vienna and Berlin. His passion was to establish a united Anatolia, and he was the founding father of the Anatolian Confederation. His political beliefs and activity led to his eventual assassination. Petros was the alter ego of Angelos Sikelianos, the poet and personal friend of Kazantzakis. The two had spent 40 days together moving between the various monasteries situated on Mount Athos. And it was Sikelianos who penned the beautiful haiku that has been so often erroneously attributed to Kazantzakis himself. I said to the almond tree, "Sister, speak to me of God." And the almond tree blossomed. Finally, it is another friend of Kazantzakis's, the businessman Myron Gunalakis, who shape-shifts into the 4th member of the Symposium, Miros. We learn from Eleni Kazantzakis, who uses the given name Mihalis for him, that in 1918, Gunalakis had accompanied Kazantzakis, Ioannis Stavridikis, and an unnamed intelligent young woman, possibly Ellie Lambridi, with whom Kazantzakis shared a close relationship, on an extended walk through the exhilarating landscape of the Swiss mountains. This trip was marked by a significant event that provides useful background to the writing of Symposium. One evening, in a deserted hotel in which they were resting, the four travellers acquiesced to a suggestion by Nikos that they address themselves to the topic of love. The resultant discussion might well be regarded as a real-life symposium. Kazantzakis himself tells us of one of the contributions he made to the interchange of ideas that took place. I identify love with elan vital, the life force, I said. The relationship of our order must not be physical intercourse, but rather an intercourse of the spirit, comprising all the pleasures of a higher intercourse. Significantly, he goes on to report that a rousing debate blazed up. They all shouted that this was contrary to nature, a horrible sacrifice, and that I was giving a religious tendency to our order. I answered that we must sacrifice individual happiness, transmute lust, and have inferior contacts only outside our own order. We must redouble our powers in order to preserve the virtue of our aspirations. It would be difficult to overemphasize the importance of that last sentence in Kazantzakis' comment. We must redouble our powers in order to preserve the virtue of our aspiration. To have aspiration is to suggest the existence of a pathway of development or progress. And it may be that we are seeing here the first articulation of the idea of ascent that was to form the cornerstone of Kazantzakis' philosophy. And we note that the aspiration that drives the ascent is a virtue, perhaps, as Kazantzakis may well be arguing, the supreme virtue. But the sentence also bears testimony to the enormous effort, the energy that must be extended if the ascent is to be entered into authentically. It is not a casual stroll up a slight incline, but a strenuous, vital engagement with the full range of the travails and challenges of life that require a doubling and a redoubling of our focus and attention. Doubtless, Kazantzakis had a memory of this Swiss trip and of this discussion in his mind when he picked up his pen and had Arpagos' guests travel from various locations to gather one evening on the terrace of his seaside home. There, they were served by Helen, sister to Arpagos, with wine and passatempo, roasted pumpkin seeds. For a period, they sat in silence, taking in the sound and aromas of the still evening, sipping occasionally from their glasses. Somewhat reluctantly, to break the silence, Arpagos spoke, almost prayed within himself, formulating the words, "Lord, Lord," hoping he would not be overheard. But to this heartfelt soliloquy there came a response from Cosmas. "Arpagos, your lips are moving. You're praying. Don't be embarrassed." And thus the discussion was launched. Any reading of Symposium will be enhanced if the reader bears in mind 3 useful clues to its understanding. The first of these is that it must be read as poetry rather than as an academic treatise. The meaning and value of the work are located within its allegorical and metaphoric use of language, and the wise reader will linger over sentences and phrases until they surrender their wisdom. Indeed, failure to recognise that in the entire Kazantzakian corpus it is always the poet who speaks imposes upon the reader a barrier to full comprehension of his arguments. In the second place, it is to be remembered that Kazantzakis, like all of us, uses the word life with 2 distinct meanings. He uses it to refer to the life of an individual, but he uses it also to refer to life as the pervasive force that permeates the universe and which underlies and sustains the life of every individual, plant, animal, or human being, and of which every individual is no more or less than a part. While he never undervalues the life of the individual, Kazantzakis never takes his eye away from the larger concept of life itself, to which he ascribes the highest possible value. The force, energy, power that is life supersedes his every concern, and it is to its sustenance and continuance that all his writing is directed. Then too, in approaching Symposium, it is important to understand that while Arpagos is the essential representative of the mind of Kazantzakis, the author uses the contribution of all participants in the discussion as vehicles for the expression of his own philosophy. One must train the ear to recognise the unique Kazantzakian contribution as it might arise anywhere within the dialogue. The 4 compatriots in this discussion are no longer young men, although they have shared many years together. They stand now not yet in the fullness of maturity, but on its brink, so that they are able to look back upon earlier days when their youthful enthusiasms engendered among them a resolve to rise up against the inadequacies of human understanding and social strife, to effect the requisite changes that would improve the human condition. In what may be regarded as a prologue to the book, Miros reviews the failure of each in realising these early ambitions. He accuses Cosmas of valuing his business activity overmuch and spending his energy in trying to make the world comply with his commercial values. He sees the poet, Petros, preoccupied with the manipulation of words that slip through man's fingers and disappear in the ether. Of himself, he says that he oscillates between hope and agitation, looking for some great leader to emerge and show the way forward. In Arpagos, however, Miros sees a retention of some of his youthful resolve. He perceives that since they last met, Arpagos seems to have disappeared into some barren ascetic discipline and withdrawn from the world. and yet he notices that his eyes still shine serenely and that he seems to exude a calming presence. Observing these qualities, he seeks an account of whatever Arpagus might have done by way of demolishing the world and then rebuilding it. And the prologue closes with his heartfelt request, "Open your heart, Arpagos, and help us." In response to this plea, and in what constitutes the second part of the book, Arpagos rehearses the historic situation over against which his own intellectual and spiritual development has taken place. With pain and passion, he reflects on the struggle of the Greeks to come to terms with the Turkish occupation of their land. And in this context, he recalls that Myros had once said to him that Greece was lost, that she had no future. Myros had felt that the country's blood had been watered down and that it had lost the capacity to generate heroes. But Arpagos also remembers his reaction to this lament by Myros. He had come to realise that Hellas is not geography and memory. She is not you and me, he declares, nor is she the thousands of Greeks who pollute her. She lives and reigns inside me, indestructible, and she has the boundaries of my soul, and her capital is the polis, the city in me. I feel inside me a new light, a new order, a new colour, a different rhythm, a spirited song like an Anatolian fairy tale. Wealth and power that don't belong to me, but to Hellas. She is inside me like a seed that kicks and doesn't let me sleep. Arpagos, Kazantzakis, has his eye fixed on something larger, more basic than Greece, something that transcends nationalism and regional, cultural, or even existential limitation. I seek a place, he announces, where I can stand sure-footed, where you too can stand. I seek to find the source of my life, that is, of universal life, and the justification of endeavour. Call it religion, God, chimera, song, delusion. What do I care? I call it liberation. Every day, he says, I struggle on this steep rock to distinguish and grasp the new countenance. Clearly, it is not only the territorial, the mundane, that concerns Arpagos. His inquiry is addressed to the spiritual quality that defines the essence of man. And so he wrestles with the question of God. He phrases this concern thus: I fought as best I could, widening the circle of my vision, conquering my individual vicissitudes, to breathe the acrid air of God. He readily acknowledges that Cosmas too had sought the religious ascent on his own terms, but that he had not managed to complete it. Speaking of himself, however, he says, Lord, I lifted myself up like a palm tree on the edge of your path so you could nourish me. I shall rise up to my peak with all my roots so you can see and delight in your works. This reference to God has led many to read Kazantzakis as a religious writer, as one seeking to enunciate a new theology in which God is understood to be some kind of developing deity. But the essence of Kazantzakis' understanding of the word God is offered through an anecdote that Arpagos recounts. He recalls a visit to the south of the Peloponnesus, where he had met an elderly peasant who told him that God had come down to earth and had spoken to man, explaining that while the 7 levels of the earth, or the 7 levels of heaven, could never contain God, yet the heart of man could. Take care, warned God, not to wound the heart of man, of even the humblest man, because I may be in there. And in this anecdote lies the seed of Kazantzakis' interpretation of God as being not the divine personality who dwells as love in the heart of man, but as the all-pervasive life force that spins its own ascending spiral in an endless creativity, utilising the life and endeavours of mankind to its own survival and progress. For Kazantzakis, God is not the benefactor of man so much as a challenge for man to excel himself in compliance with the dictates of the life force. Thus, for Arpagos, the human must serve an end, an objective that transcends the present. And if we inquire of him what that end might be, he responds first in the negative and then positively. The end is not some master, some supreme being who has created us and then disciplines us to prepare us to spend eternity in his company. I know, he explains, that life is a spark that shines for a moment between 2 endless nights. But I want, out of pride, not out of hope, to hold my body straight and let the holy spark at my head consume and melt it. In the straight body and the consuming activity of the spark, the new is created, the higher standard attained, and life sustained, enriched, and enabled to pursue its upward thrust. In this dual-edged treatment of the historic Greek dilemma and the human acknowledgement of a personal spirituality as distinct from a religious sensibility, Symposium reflects the genesis of critical elements in Kazantzakian thought. In identifying Greekness as humanness and in positing man as the expression of a creative energy, Arpagos takes us ever closer to the heart of the Kazantzakian philosophy of ascent. Man is not adrift in a meaningless universe, but set in the midst of a creative thrust that creates meaning out of chaos. In his treatment of these 2 themes, Kazantzakis makes it clear that the underlying value of his writings lies in his burning desire for the facilitation of the life force. This response from Arpagos brings tears to the eyes of Miros, and as his tears fall, the second part of the book comes to a close. Periodically, Helen replenished with wine the glasses from which the 4 men took leisurely sips, as the discourse continued to flow between them. Without being intrusive, She ensured that there was always sufficient souvlakia and other light food on the intimate indoor table around which they had now gathered. They nibbled almost without being aware of it. Their minds transcended their environment. The third and final section of the work is presented in the form of a confession by Arpagos. In fact, what we are presented with is an account of the anguished pathway Kazantzakis had taken through infancy, childhood and young manhood as he struggled to create the adult thinker and man of action that he has sought to become. He depicts the inner chaos through which he has travelled as being adorned with three masks. In keeping with the plan he had outlined to Rahel, he named these three masks God, war, and women, a formidable trinity, as he called them, that struggled within his soul in an attempt to achieve a mystical synthesis or an abounding unity. These three masks, representing respectively his spiritual nature, his national background, and his carnal being, pressed their separate claims on him until he was able to relate them to each other in an interpretation of identity and experience that, far from negating any of them, held them in a creative tension. By way of illustrating his developmental struggle, we might note an important interlude during which Arpagos reflects on a personal matter, the issue of his interaction with his own father. The relationship between Kazantzakis and his father, Mihalis, was characterised by tension. At the heart of the conflict between them was the distinction between the contemplative life and that of the active pelakari, or young warrior, who gave his energies to an overthrowing of oppression and the re-establishment of national grandeur. The dispute between father and son fully manifested itself upon Kazantzakis' return home in 1924, following a visit to Vienna and Berlin, when his father accused him of wasting his time and energy in reflection and writing. It was exacerbated by Mihalis' refusing to discuss the matter and retreating to his room in a sullen silence, a form of emotional withdrawal that again and again set the Kazantzakis household on tenterhooks. Despite this tension, Kazantzakis had a profound respect for his father. He well understood the nationalism that drove him and the passion of his disdain for the Turk. Yet he understood that his father lacked the sensitivity and serenity of mind and soul that were the hallmarks of his mother's personality. Tragically, it was not until after the death of Mihalis that Kazantzakis, on his own confession, found himself able to love him with an unfettered affection. Much of the conflicted love he felt towards his father found expression in the portrait he painted of him in his subsequent novel, Captain Mihalis, translated into English as Freedom or Death. There is also a stirring account of their ambivalent relationship in the second chapter of Report to Greco. Arpagos deals with Kazantzakis' parental dilemma through the vehicle of a dream, which he relates to his guests. In his account of the dream, he exposes all the pain of the relationship but only by way of preparing them to grasp the enormity of the lesson his father had ultimately taught him. "Get up," his father had insisted. "You're seeking God? Here he is. His action, full of mistakes, gropings, perseverance and struggle. God is not a force that founds eternal harmony, but the force that eternally breaks every harmony, always seeking something higher. And the person who struggles and moves forward in his narrow circle with this method finds God and works with him." In drawing attention to the conflicts and contests that constitute disharmony, Mihalis provides his son with a foundation for the notion of creative destruction that the scholar Lewis Owens believes lies at the heart of the Kazantzakian philosophy. Lewis contends that Kazantzakis recognised a dialectic, a set of primary conflicting principles, namely destruction and creation, in which destruction is a prerequisite for any creative act. Thus, death, far from simply being the opposite of life, is a necessary constituent of its very nature. What Kazantzakis seeks in the end, writes Martin Levitt, is not some simple harmonious form, not the resolution of tension, but the accretion of tension, not unity, but multiplicity. There are no final, well-balanced reconciliations in his writing, no closed and definitive endings. The tension in his art and in his life are ongoing tensions, and it is from them that creativity emerges. Using Arpegos as his mouthpiece, Kazantzakis not only provides us with some understanding of the nature of creative destruction, but offers us also the outline of a methodology for the spiritualization of life that is at once the essence and means of ascent. He illustrates this by recalling his earlier visit to Mount Athos, where he had gone to re-examine and refashion his self-understanding to accord with his own demanding intellectual integrity. "On the first day, I sat quietly and planned my asceticism," he tells us. "I laid out my program the way I have always liked, with figures, with strict logical tools, with geometrical madness. My plan was simple. I would divide myself into two camps, the higher and the lower, the one in the light and the other in the dark, the soul and the body. And I would finally declare open war between them. I told myself, I shall humble and constrict to the limit the desires of the flesh. Does it want to sleep? I'll stay awake. Does it want to eat? I'll fast. Does it want to sleep? I'll refuse. Does it want to sit? I'll get up and climb the mountain. Is it cold? I'll strip and walk on the stones. I would have to take asceticism as a method of discipline, the submission of the lower to the higher wheel that grasps the mud as it revolves and gives it the countenance it wants. And slowly I would rise to harder labours. When I subdue the flesh, I shall turn to the soul and divide it. Lower and higher, human and divine. I shall fight the small spiritual pleasures, reading and recollection, the gratification of victory, justice, friendship and tenderness, joy and sorrow. And again, if I won for a second time, I would proclaim a new severance within me. Down with hope, the final enemy. While high above me, the flame of God would be consuming me, smokeless, without a flicker, in profound darkness and silence. As if suspecting that his guests had failed to grasp what he had recounted, Arpagos restated his position in a simple parable. One morning, he tells his companion, I was walking down an island seashore. I saw a huge lamp of clay being kneaded by the idle hands of a labourer, and I saw it rise suddenly and dance on the whetstone, overcoming its heavy nature and taking on all the marvels of gyration as though it were spirit, as though it were a ringlet of fire. This is the kind of hand I was beginning to feel inside me, crushing me. And what a holy dance. This image of dance is not to be mistaken as a frivolous self-indulgence on the part of an individual. For Kazantzakis, as for his dear friend Zorba, dance is an ecstatic energy, that of the life force itself, set free from the opposing forces that would hold it in restraint, and joyously seeking the next stage on its perpetual exploration of its own potential and the limitless expanse of the possible. In a very real sense, the discussion shared between Arpagos, Cosmas, Petros and Miros is a form of verbal dance that itself captures and expresses something of that ecstatic energy. Although it is sometimes dismissed as an early and a somewhat inconsequential work, we now close the pages of Symposium and replace it on the shelf, convinced that it remains a significant document in which is set out for us the historic, intellectual and spiritual development of Crete's most important native writer, and which exposes part of the foundation upon which he was to develop his compelling argument for a philosophy of ascent. Read in conjunction with Saviours of God, The Odyssey, a modern sequel, and Report to Greco, it constitutes a valuable contribution to a body of work that enriches the human intellect and empowers the human spirit.